My guest at this time has represented WWE in several high-profile legal cases for decades. It is Jerry McDevitt. Jerry, thank you very much for giving me some of your time.
Nice to be with you, Nick.
Well, before we get into this very interesting CTE case and your dealings with a man named Kairos, Constantine Kairos, his name already sounds like a wrestler's name, by the way. I'd be interested to hear, Jerry, like, what's your background with wrestling? When did you get into the business, and like, how did you get hooked up with WWE?
I started with him back in 1987. I was doing basic commercial work at the law firm I'm with here in Pittsburgh, and one of their wrestlers, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, who was at that time part of the Hart Foundation with Bret Hart, was flying into Pittsburgh to do an event up at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh. Him and Bret were then the tag team champs of the WWE, which I didn't know at the time because I really didn't follow wrestling that much at that point in my life.
Sure.
And at the end of the flight, Jim got arrested by the FBI and charged with interference with the flight crew, with the allegation being that he had gotten in a fight with one of the flight attendants in a dispute over drinks during the flight.
Oh, my God.
And charged with a federal felony of interference with the flight crew.
Oh.
And I had been at that point working on a case out in Colorado with a lawyer who was then representing the WWE. We were working on a case oddly involving air pollution control devices out in Colorado together, and his name was Ted Dinsmore. Ted called me that night and asked me if I would represent Neidhart, which I said, sure, well, I'll be glad to represent him.
Yeah.
And did represent him and got him acquitted of all charges and brought a malicious prosecution case thereafter and got him a lot of money for his trouble. And that's how I met Vince and Linda, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, it is. And so, I think it's really interesting. I've been reading up on you before we chatted here today, and I've seen Vince say some very nice things about you. A resource that cannot, a resource that cannot be replaced, I think, was one of the quotes. What is your relationship like with Vince? What's it like to be like friendly with Vince McMahon?
Well, it's an interesting thing that someday I always kid him I'm going to write a book if I ever get done doing all these legal cases and have time to write a book. But the first words Vince ever said to me when I met him personally was, "I hate lawyers." And and I think I said something to him along the lines of, "Well, I don't really like them all that much either, Vince," which is true. I don't.
Yeah.
And now, it's not that uncommon when we have a conversation, 30, 40 years later now, at the end of the conversation to say, I love you, Jerry. And I love him too. I mean, that's what happens when you go through 40 years of the kind of ordeals that he and the company have had to go through to do what they do. It's just been an amazing journey. And so we're very close. It's not your normal lawyer-client relationship anymore. It's more like family.
Wow, that's incredible. And, before we get one last thing before we get to the CTE case here, everybody seems to have like a funny Vince McMahon story. When you think about Vince, is there like a particular fond memory or something enjoyable that comes to mind that you'd like to share with everyone, or are those personal thoughts you'd like to keep to yourself?
No, you have a ton of them. I have some personal thoughts of them. I have some funny thoughts of them. The thing that I remember most about Vince was back in the late 80s, early 90s, when the feds were investigating the company, and the New York Post was writing a lot of really bad articles about the company that just were full of lies and untruths and things of that nature, and portraying the company in just a terrible light. And I was up there on that day, and I was still at that point getting to know Vince. I didn't know him as well as I do now, so as a lawyer, you're always kind of gauging the people you represent as to whether they're worth the effort it takes to actually do this.
Yeah.
And so we had this meeting in his office, and it was just a horrible day. It was front page stories in the New York Post that were terrible about the company and that he loves so passionately and whatnot. And so he came out of the office. It was late at night. I was sort of walking ahead of him, and as I came out the door of his office, I saw Nick, the janitor, sort of mopping the halls, and said hi to him. Just nodded my head. And was walking ahead, and Vince came out, and the janitor got all puffed up and said, "Hey, Vince, how you doing?" And Vince stopped in his tracks and went over and put his arm around Nick and was talking to him and asking him how he was doing, how his family was, and whatnot. And I'm watching this whole scene. I'm thinking, that takes a pretty incredible guy to be able to put aside all his personal issues that came up today with the terrible publicity and all the rest of that, to take time to talk to the janitor and ask, how he's doing with his family and whatnot. And I found out later, Nick, that Nick apparently had some kidney issue that made him, it was almost impossible for him to do his job without a dialysis machine. And the McMahons had apparently bought a dialysis machine for him so he could continue his job as janitor.
Wow.
And I thought, that's pretty remarkable that he did that. And I just thought at that point, this is a very interesting guy.
Yeah.
And then one of the funnier stories, there's a ton of funny stories with Vince, but one with, one point in time, Jesse Ventura had gotten a rather large verdict at the time against the company for, I think, $1 million back around the same time as the criminal trial was going on back in the early 90s, before I was representing them in civil cases. And so I'm handling this criminal case, and Jesse gets this $1 million verdict against him through some lawyer. I can't remember his name anymore.
Sure.
David Olson, that's his name. And so after the criminal trial was over, Olson thought he was going to turn this into, I guess, bringing a lot of these kind of lawsuits and cash in a couple different times. So he brought one on behalf of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. And so Olson's now taking depositions of Vince, and I'm representing him now. And the day before, he had taken Linda's deposition to find out what she knew about the case and whatnot. So Olson starts off the deposition with Vince, and when Vince goes into a deposition, it's kind of funny because he doesn't do the normal stuff people do where the lawyers usually put their hand out to shake hands and whatnot. And he's very honest. He says, "Look, I'm not here to be your friend. You sued me. I'm not going to shake your hand. Why would I shake your hand? You sued me. I'm not." Which is very honest, because why would you?
Yeah, it's true.
And
yeah.
And he's chomping on these Tic Tacs at the time, like they're nails or whatnot. And so Olson says to him, "Well, Mr. McMahon, are you aware that your wife gave a deposition yesterday?" And Vince goes, "Yes," and he's chomping on these Tic Tacs. And then Olson says, "And did she talk to you or tell you anything about the deposition?" And Vince goes, "Yes, she did," and he's chomping on the Tic Tacs. And Olson goes, "Well, what did she tell you?" And Vince says, "She said you look like a ferret." and he keeps chomping on these Tic Tacs, and Olson goes, "Well, I should have expected something like that from you, Mr. McMahon, And Vince goes, "Hey, listen, you told me I had to tell the truth. I took an oath to tell the truth. You asked me what she said. That's what she said. You look like a ferret." And I mean, he was never the same the rest of his deposition. We ended up winning the case on summary judgment, and he went away. But there's a million of those kind of stories I could tell you. He's just a hoot to work with.
Oh my God! All right, that's great. Thank you for those stories. Wonderful. I always love good Vince stories. All right, well, let's dive into it, Jerry. Here, the reason that we set up this chat today, the latest legal victory you have for WWE came in this class action CTE case, where the wrestlers were represented by, again, this guy Konstantin Kairos, who I have to believe is a pro wrestler. There's no way that name is real. Can you please just kind of recap and walk everybody through what exactly this case was about and kind of how it played out? Because it went on for like 6 years or so.
Yeah, well, in the beginning, we noticed back in prior to October of 2014, we noticed this Kairos fellow was advertising on the internet and soliciting former wrestlers to contact him to bring lawsuits that would be patterned after the cases that had been brought against the NFL, which, if you remember, resulted in the NFL agreeing to pay $1 billion plus to end up settling.
Right.
And when they did that, they kind of emboldened a lot of the plaintiffs' bar and class action lawyers and whatnot to sue anybody that had any kind of history with head trauma or concussions or things of that nature. And so they did. They brought lawsuits against college football teams, the NCAA, and high school teams, water polo, you name it.
Yeah.
And Kairos' solicitations, suggested, and his website suggested, incorrectly, we believe, that he had somehow been involved in obtaining this settlement for the NFL players and would be able to replicate that if only these wrestlers would agree to hire him so he could sue the WWE to get the same amount of money and the same thing for former wrestlers. So he was basically soliciting them with promises of, there's nothing to lose. You can get money out of this, and I'll take a contingent fee of what I get, but it won't cost you anything. And he actually went out on radio shows and stuff and podcasts and was making statements to the effect that, the more people that sign up, the more pressure we can bring on WWE to settle these cases and pay us a lot of money. And, we know he had told these people that he would be able to use this litigation to renegotiate contracts that were expired long ago and get them better royalties and a bunch of nonsense, frankly. And I feel bad that he misled so many people, because he did. And eventually Billy Jack Haynes, sort of a known sociopath, frankly, became the first person to sign up for this and brought a lawsuit out in Washington in October of 2014.
Okay.
That was his first class action case, and then in short order after that, Vito LaGrasso and a kid by the name of Evan Singleton, who was at NXT. Well, it wasn't NXT then, but it was down at the Performance Center.
Sure.
They brought a second case in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Then there was a third class action case brought out in California by Russ McCullough and two other ex-performers. Then there was a case brought in Tennessee on behalf of some girl who was Doink's girlfriend or something like that.
Yeah.
For his wrongful death. And then the widow of Mabel, Nelson Frazier, brought a wrongful death case down in Tennessee. And so all those cases we basically had transferred up to Connecticut, because they all had contracts that said litigation would proceed in Connecticut.
Sure.
And then after that was done, then Kairos brought in even another lawsuit on behalf of 50 or 60 people who signed up in a so-called mass action complaint, with Joe Laurinaitis being the lead plaintiff in that case, and 60 other people, or however many there were, signed up to be the plaintiffs in that case, all making these sort of claims about alleged brain injuries, CTE, and all the rest of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And in the last case, in the Laurinaitis case, he tried to throw in these claims for more money in royalties and a bunch of nonsense stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so that's what basically happened. And we, unlike the NFL, decided we were not going to pay anything, and we're going to contest these claims because we knew what they were, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what was the crux that allowed you to win this case? Why do you feel that the decision was made in your favor?
Well, Connecticut has a statute of limitations, among other things, that says that you have 3 years from, in the words of the statute, the act or omission complained of to bring a lawsuit for injuries. And so if the act or omission complained of is getting hit on the head and getting caused concussions or CTE or whatnot, to the extent you're trying to blame somebody for that, you have 3 years from the time that happened to bring the lawsuit. And some of these people, particularly the ones in the Laurinaitis case, I mean, there was, I can't remember his name, but his claims would have been time barred under the statute during the administration of Richard Nixon. Others would have been barred time when Jimmy Carter was the president. And so these claims were really old and stale. Beyond that, there was nothing that would indicate that the WWE had done anything wrong or had ever concealed anything from anybody. The evidence is pretty clear, actually, Nick. It's unfortunate, but it's clear that the first time that there was any indication of CTE having anything in professional wrestling was in the case of Chris Benoit.
Right.
And with the publicity that occurred with Chris Benoit, I mean, it's not even plausible for anybody in the wrestling business, especially wrestlers and especially people who knew Chris Benoit, to say that they were not aware of the fact that Chris Benoit had been diagnosed with CTE, supposedly, and that had been associated with head trauma. So, as early as, and that occurred in 2007.
Right.
So, by 2007, there's not anybody in the wrestling business who can plausibly say they didn't know about the Benoit findings, and thus, if you did have any kind of symptoms or whatnot, you sure shouldn't have been waiting until 2014 or 2016 to be bringing the lawsuits. Yeah. And most of these people, to be honest with you, Nick, although there are some exceptions, most of these people didn't even perform solely for WWE or even long for WWE. There are people here in these class of people that had nothing more than a cup of coffee with the WWE and were gone thereafter,
Yeah.
So it was just a money grab. And then other ones, Evan Singleton, for example, you can go online and type his name in Instagram. This is a guy who was claiming that he was totally disabled, couldn't drive a car, couldn't do anything as a result of a single concussion that he got when he was performing down at the Performance Center. Yet you can find pictures of him online, deadlifting 800 pounds and competing in world strongman contests. He's he's one of the strongest men in the world competing in athletics while he's filing lawsuits in court saying he's totally disabled and can't even drive a car.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff. And all of this was exposed to the judge. Kairos got caught in the last lawsuit basically plagiarizing from the lawsuit of the NFL, where the allegations that were made against the NFL that resulted in a case being successful against them were that the NFL, unlike the WWE, had made various public statements and actually published articles in scientific literatures and magazines and whatnot, sort of downplaying, if you will, the effects of concussions. And Roger Goodell had allegedly made various statements that were alleged in the complaints against the NFL. Well, what Kairos did is he gets a hold of the NFL complaint, and he literally just changes, where the complaint would say, Roger Goodell said the following, that concussions don't cause any long-term damage and it's safe to go back to work on the day you get a concussion. He would just change that to say a WWE representative had said that. Just flat out make up false things like that, that who just the kind of stuff lawyers don't do. And we brought that to the court's attention and multiple other violations of his. And he was, as a result of his misconduct, sanctioned 3 different times by the federal judge up there that had control of the case, and is now facing sanctions orders that we say is going to make him require to pay us hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so that's the thing. You said you've mentioned twice that all there is to do is collect here from Konstantin Kairos. How much does he owe you all? And do you worry that he won't pay or something like that? I don't know.
Well, who knows whether he has. I know he practices out of his house. I mean, he had. You can find people on the internet like Billy Jack Haynes and some of the early people that he talked to that are espousing what I gather he must have told them, that he was this big-time lawyer who had brought the NFL to its knees and had, gotten them all that money, and he was going to do the same to WWE and all the rest of that. But the reality of it is, I think he practices out of his house in Massachusetts. I don't think he has an office in Massachusetts. But I think what he's done is he's spent a career sort of drumming up litigation by these kind of techniques. Yeah. And then he typically gets other lawyers to jump in the case and actually do the litigating for him. And that's what he did here. And when he originally filed these cases, there was something like, 5 or 6 other law firms that jumped in thinking, this was going to be a good thing to be involved in on the plaintiff side of the case. But then as we started exposing more of what was going on, by the time the case was over and it got thrown out, he was getting sanctioned, they were jumping off the ship as fast as you could, and bailing out, saying they didn't want anything more to do with the case, so that by the time we got to the appeal, Kairos was pretty much standing alone. None of the original law firms stayed with him and said, we don't want anything more to do with this case.
Man, wow. That sucks for him. That's a bad spot to be in.
Well, it tells you something that the reputable lawyers got out of the case.
Yeah, wow. Well, Jerry, thank you for walking me and our listeners through this. I know there's been a lot of attention around it and a lot of interest in it, and I know you don't do a lot of these type of interviews, but I think it was great, man. If there's other WWE cases that come up that you would like to talk more about, I'm happy to listen, man. I think it's really interesting stuff here. What you do, I know you weren't involved in it, but I sat in the in Chicago here. I sat in the CM Punk Colt Cabana versus Amon courtroom. And it was days of just talking and slides and everything. It's very tedious what you do.
Yeah, no, it's very detail-oriented work. I'm familiar with that trial. I wish I would have been in that trial, but we weren't. But in any event, it is what it is. And it's basically all we do is recreate history, and the one who wins is usually the one who recreates it the most accurately and truthfully and honestly with the jury, and that's what we try to do.